September 21st, 1327. Within the grim, impenetrable walls of Berkeley Castle, a king lay dying, his screams echoing through sealed chambers, deliberately muffled so the world outside might pretend not to hear the ultimate betrayal unfolding within. This was not the dignified passing of a monarch, nor the swift, clean end of an execution. It was a premeditated, agonizing torment, a meticulously orchestrated act of brutality designed to leave no external trace, yet to inflict maximum, devastating pain. The air itself seemed to grow heavy with the horror contained, a palpable, haunted presence that would cling to the very stones of the fortress for centuries to come. Those who orchestrated this grim spectacle, shrouded in the cloak of political expediency, understood the power of silence, the chilling efficacy of preventing any witness to the final, desperate moments of a man who had once worn the crown of England. Edward II, a king dethroned, stripped of his regalia, his authority, and ultimately his very humanity, found himself at the mercy of forces he could no longer command, cornered within a system that had turned irrevocably against him. His final agony, a whispered legend for generations, stands as a testament to the fragility of power and the chilling lengths to which political ambition and vengeful hearts can descend. The sealing of that chamber was more than an act of concealment. It was a symbolic severing, an attempt to erase a life deemed inconvenient, a desperate effort to bury the uncomfortable truths of a kingdom in turmoil beneath a blanket of forced quiet. But history, much like the echoes of those muffled screams, has a way of reverberating, refusing to be silenced, ensuring that some stories, no matter how profoundly disturbing, gain immortality through the sheer weight of their tragic truth. The very act of sealing the room became the ultimate confession, a testament to the unspeakable nature of the deeds committed within, a perpetual stain on the historical record, forever invoking questions of morality and the terrible cost of absolute control. To understand why a king, anointed by God and sworn to protect his realm, could meet such an ignominious and brutal end, we must cast our gaze back to the tumultuous early years of Edward II's reign. He ascended to the throne in 1307, following his formidable father, Edward I, a king renowned for his martial prowess and unyielding will. Yet, almost immediately, Edward II demonstrated a character markedly different from his stern predecessor. Where Edward I was consumed by conquest and governance, Edward II seemed more inclined towards jousting, farming, and the companionship of a select few, most notably Piers Gaveston. This preference for personal relationships, particularly with men seen as low-born or ill-suited for royal favor, deeply offended the powerful baronial class, who viewed Gaveston as an arrogant upstart, exerting undue influence over their sovereign. The resentment simmered, a dangerous undercurrent threatening to erode the very foundations of royal authority. Edward's perceived indifference to the traditional duties of kingship, coupled with his lavish patronage of Gaveston, created a deep chasm between the monarch and his nobility. It was not merely personal distaste, it was a profound crisis of governance, a king seemingly unconcerned with the sacrifice required of his office, squandering royal resources and diminishing the dignity of the crown. The repeated exiles and recalls of Gaveston only exacerbated the tensions, demonstrating Edward's stubborn devotion to his friend over the stability of his kingdom. This obstinacy, seen by many as a fatal flaw, laid the groundwork for the future unraveling of his reign, slowly but surely alienating the powerful factions whose loyalty was essential for the secure exercise of royal power. The seeds of his downfall were sown not in malice, but in a profound disconnect between a king's personal desires and the immense responsibilities of his crown. The escalating friction between Edward II and his barons culminated in the imposition of the Ordinances of 1311, a radical attempt by the nobility to curb royal power and force a more compliant style of governance. These ordinances, a testament to the increasing fragility of power wielded by the monarch, demanded the exile of Gaveston once more, and asserted the barons' right to approve royal appointments and declare war. Edward's initial resistance was fierce, but the mounting pressure, coupled with the threat of civil war, ultimately forced his reluctant acceptance. Yet the peace was fleeting. Edward, ever defiant, soon recalled Gaveston, igniting a fresh wave of outrage. The barons, led by the formidable Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, now took decisive action. In 1312, Piers Gaveston was captured and summarily executed, a brutal act that sent shockwaves through the kingdom and irrevocably poisoned the relationship between Edward and his most powerful subjects. This was no ordinary legal proceeding. It was an extra-legal act of defiance, a clear signal that the magnates were willing to bypass royal authority to achieve their aims. The sacrifice of Gaveston was intended to be a warning to the king, a demonstration of the barons' collective strength and their unwavering determination to impose their will. For Edward, it was a profound personal loss and an unforgivable affront to his sovereignty. This act of violence cemented a deep-seated animosity, transforming political disagreement into a bitter, personal vendetta that would haunt the remainder of his reign. The death of his favorite did not reform Edward's approach to kingship, but rather hardened his resolve, setting him on a path of confrontation that would ultimately lead to his own undoing. Despite the devastating loss of Gaveston, Edward II remained stubbornly resistant to the demands of his nobility. In the vacuum left by his fallen favorite, new figures emerged to dominate the king's affections and the machinery of government: Hugh Despencer the Younger and his father, Hugh Despencer the Elder. These men, ambitious and avaricious, quickly amassed vast wealth and influence, often at the expense of other nobles, provoking a fresh wave of outrage that mirrored the earlier resentment towards Gaveston. Their rapacious land-grabbing and their perceived arrogance deepened the chasm between the crown and its increasingly alienated subjects. The Despensers' insatiable greed and their monopolization of royal favor became a rallying cry for the opposition, consolidating diverse grievances into a unified front against the king and his new companions. This period saw Edward become even more reliant on a small, loyal faction, effectively isolating himself from the broader political landscape, making his reign increasingly precarious. The brutality of their self-serving policies, coupled with Edward's unwavering support for them, further eroded any remaining shred of goodwill among the English magnates. The kingdom descended into a state of near civil war, with numerous baronial uprisings and a pervasive sense of instability. The fragility of power was not merely a concept, it was a lived reality, as the king's authority waned, and the loyalty of his subjects became a commodity increasingly difficult to secure. The stage was thus set for a more profound and personal betrayal, one that would originate not from disgruntled barons, but from within the very heart of his own royal household. Amidst the growing chaos and Edward's unshakable devotion to the Despensers, Queen Isabella, a woman of considerable intelligence and political acumen, found herself increasingly marginalized and humiliated. A French princess, daughter of the powerful Philip IV, Isabella initially sought to bridge the gap between her husband and his discontented barons. However, her influence waned as the Despensers solidified their control over Edward, even reportedly denying her access to her own children and confiscating her lands. This personal torment, coupled with the king's public preference for his male companions, led to a deep and abiding resentment in the queen. In 1325, a diplomatic mission to France offered Isabella an escape from her oppressive circumstances. She was sent to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV, regarding the disputed Aquitaine. Once in France, Isabella made a fateful decision. She refused to return to England. This was not merely an act of defiance, it was a political maneuver of immense consequence. In Paris, she found a powerful ally in Roger Mortimer, a prominent baron who had been exiled from England for his opposition to Edward and the Despensers. Their liaison, both personal and political, became the nucleus of a burgeoning rebellion. Isabella, once a neglected queen, now embraced her role as a leader of the English exiles, transforming herself into a formidable adversary. The moral inversion was stark. The queen, meant to be the king's closest confidant and supporter, now conspired openly for his downfall, driven by a cocktail of personal slight and political ambition. Her transformation from a vulnerable wife to a vengeful, determined force represents a pivotal moment in this unfolding, devastating narrative. With Roger Mortimer as her unwavering confederate, Queen Isabella embarked upon the most daring and brutal phase of her campaign to unseat Edward II. Having secured the support of her brother, the French king, and amassed a considerable force of mercenaries and English exiles, Isabella and Mortimer launched their invasion of England in September 1326. Their landing on the Suffolk coast was met not with resistance but with widespread public acclaim. The English populace, weary of the dispenser's tyranny and the king's perceived ineptitude, largely welcomed Isabella as a liberator. Support for Edward evaporated with shocking speed, a testament to the absolute fragility of power when it loses the consent of the governed. The dispensers, the architects of Edward's political isolation, were quickly hunted down. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured and executed without trial, a stark demonstration of the new regime's ruthlessness. His son, Hugh the Younger, met an even more gruesome end. Drawn and quartered in Hereford before a cheering crowd, his execution a horrifying public spectacle designed to sate the years of accumulated hatred. Edward II, abandoned by virtually everyone, fled westward, desperately seeking refuge. His flight was a pathetic, solitary journey, a monarch stripped of his court, his army, and his dignity. The pursuit was relentless, a hauntingly reverent chase of a fallen king, until, finally, on November 16, 1326, he was captured near Neath Abbey in South Wales. The king was now a prisoner in his own kingdom, his capture marking the definitive end of his reign, setting the stage for the final, devastating act of this tragic drama. The capture of Edward II presented Isabella and Mortimer with a profound dilemma: how to legitimize their seizure of power and prevent any future attempts at restoration. Their solution was as unprecedented as it was humiliating: the forced abdication of a reigning English monarch. On January 13, 1327, a delegation of magnates, including bishops and earls, was sent to Kenilworth Castle, where Edward was being held. Their mission was to persuade, or rather compel, the king to relinquish his crown in favor of his son, the young Edward III. Edward II, distraught and physically weakened by his captivity, initially resisted, pleading for his continued reign, if only in name. Yet faced with the stark threat of deposition and the crowning of another claimant not of his blood, a revolutionary and terrifying prospect for the era, he ultimately yielded. In a somber and deeply symbolic ceremony, a truly hauntingly reverent moment for the English monarchy, Edward II formally renounced his kingship. He was reported to have wept openly as he accepted his fate, a broken man stripped of the sacred mantle of royalty. This act, meticulously documented, was a critical step in providing a veneer of legality to Isabella and Mortimer's usurpation. But the very act of forcing a king to abdicate revealed the deep fissures within the body politic and the precariousness of divine right when confronted by overwhelming force. Edward's life, once a symbol of absolute power, had now been utterly inverted, a sacrifice on the altar of political expediency, leaving him utterly vulnerable, a mere pawn in a game he had long lost. Despite Edward II's forced abdication and the coronation of his 14-year-old son, Edward III, the new regime of Isabella and Mortimer remained deeply insecure. Edward II, even as a deposed king, represented a potent threat. His very existence served as a potential rallying point for disaffected elements within the kingdom who might seek his restoration. The whispers of his continued presence, even in captivity, were enough to stir unease. Mortimer, in particular, was acutely aware of the fragility of power he and Isabella now held. Their authority, built on rebellion, needed absolute consolidation. It became increasingly clear that for their grip on power to be secure, Edward II had to be permanently removed from the political landscape. The historical accounts speak of a chilling communication, often attributed to Mortimer, sent to Edward's custodians, a cryptic Latin phrase, Edwardum occidere nolit, timere bonum est. This phrase, deliberately ambiguous, could be punctuated in two ways, each with a vastly different meaning. Edwardum occidere nolit, timere bonum est. Do not kill Edward, it is good to fear. Or, Edwardum occidere nolite timere bonum est. To kill Edward, do not fear, it is good. The second interpretation, the one ultimately adopted, served as a tacit yet unambiguous instruction for regicide. This was not a call for justice. It was a cold, calculated political imperative. The devastating decision, made in the shadows of power, sealed Edward's fate, transforming him from a deposed king into a marked man, his life now a mere obstacle to be removed for the sake of the new order. The moral cost of such a decision, a brutality veiled in strategic necessity, would forever haunt the legacy of those who commanded it. With his fate sealed by the chilling whispered instruction, Edward II was moved from one castle to another, a prisoner in a cruel game of cat and mouse. From Kenilworth, he was transferred to Corfe Castle, and finally to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a remote and foreboding stronghold perfectly suited for the dark purpose that awaited him. During his captivity, Edward was subjected to various forms of psychological and physical torment, designed perhaps to break his spirit or even to hasten his natural death, thereby absolving his captors of the direct charge of regicide. Accounts, some more sensational than others, suggest he was subjected to indignities such as being forced to shave in a field with cold, muddy water, dressed in meager clothes, and denied proper food and rest. These acts of deliberate degradation were intended to systematically strip him of his remaining dignity and humanity, making him seem less like a king and more like a common criminal or even an animal. The journey to Berkeley, under the care of his new custodians Thomas Gurney and William Auchley, was arduous and fraught with a palpable sense of impending doom. Every passing mile brought him closer to the devastating end planned for him. This period of his life, a slow, agonizing descent into utter powerlessness, highlights the profound fragility of power and the brutality of its removal. Edward II, once the sovereign lord of England, was now merely a body to be transported, a problem to be solved, his every breath a reminder of the previous regime and a threat to the stability of the new. The haunted silence of his final days, broken only by the whispers of his tormentors, set the stage for the unspeakable act that would define his historical memory. The climax of this somber narrative unfolded on the night of September 21st, 1327, within the thick stone walls of Berkeley Castle. The method chosen for Edward II's death was one of calculated brutality and chilling ingenuity, designed to be both effective and, crucially, to leave no outward marks of violence. While the exact details are shrouded in the mists of historical ambiguity and later embellishment, the most widely accepted and hauntingly reverent account describes a devastating implement, a red-hot poker thrust into the king's bowels through a horn or pipe. This unspeakable act ensured internal hemorrhage and agonizing death, yet presented the appearance of a natural demise to any cursory external examination. The motive was clear: to avoid public outrage over regicide and to maintain the fragile illusion of legitimate rule for Isabella and Mortimer. The infamous act of sealing the room was not merely about privacy. It was a deliberate and cruel act of concealment, an attempt to prevent anyone from bearing witness to the king's unimaginable screams. Those cries, though muffled, would have been a damning testament to the torment inflicted, a sound that would forever pierce the thin veil of official lies. The absence of external wounds allowed the official story of Edward's natural death to be propagated, but the truth, whispered and suspected, nevertheless permeated the political consciousness of England. This chilling precision, the deliberate choice of a method that would erase the evidence of brutality while maximizing the internal sacrifice, speaks volumes about the cold, analytical mindset of those who ordered it. It was not justice. It was an execution designed to be both final and deniable. The morning after Edward II's agonizing death, the official announcement was made. The former king had died of natural causes. His body, meticulously prepared, was put on public display at Gloucester Cathedral, reportedly to dispel rumors of foul play. Yet despite the efforts to present a dignified end, the whispers of brutality and torment persisted, forever clinging to the memory of Edward II and the reputations of Isabella and Mortimer. The very act of sealing the room at Berkeley Castle and the subsequent efforts to control the narrative only served to fuel suspicion, cementing the haunted image of his final hours in the collective historical consciousness. Edward III, though crowned king, remained under the manipulative influence of his mother and Mortimer for several years. However, as he matured, the full weight of his father's tragic fate and the ignominious manner of his death began to fuel his resentment. In 1330, a decisive coup orchestrated by Edward III himself saw Roger Mortimer apprehended and swiftly executed, hanged at Tyburn, a grim echo of the fate he had orchestrated for the Despensers. Isabella was spared execution but was placed under house arrest for the remainder of her life, her power irrevocably broken. The moral inversion was complete. The architects of the king's downfall ultimately met their own reckoning, victims of the very fragility of power they had so brutally exploited. Edward II's legacy is not one of a great king, but of a man caught in the grinding gears of political ambition and personal animosity. His death, a devastating act of state violence against the defenseless, stands as a sobering warning. When systems meant to protect the vulnerable fail, and when the desire for control eclipses all ethical boundaries, the consequences can reverberate through immortality, leaving an indelible stain on the annals of history, forever reminding us of the chilling capacity for calculated cruelty that lurks beneath the surface of power.